Hello, in this video I'm going to go over your homework and show you some previous student examples. Now this Sarah Siblet drawing is not an example of this assignment, but is a great place to start. So for your assignment, you are going to draw your hand and your arm 4 times on a single sheet of paper. But for this drawing, it's not a series of studies of your hand, but a composition of your hand moving across the page. So think of this as a finished drawing in which you're animating, almost stop motion animating your hand as it moves across the page. Things that you want to consider are not only the gesture of your hands as they move across the page, but how you organize the overall image on your piece of paper and how your eyes move from one hand to another hand to another hand. Let's look at some previous student examples. Now, please keep in mind as we're looking at these student examples that I have given this assignment many times over the years, and in some cases the students were working on toned paper, and in some cases the students were working on pieces of paper that they had already spent hours drawing on. In other words, they had to do their homework on their in-class experimental drawing. So you'll see a lot of pentamente in the back of these drawings. In this drawing, you can see the artist is capturing their hands moving across the page from one side to the other. They chose to really lean into capturing lots of different types of mark making as they did this drawing. You can see they not only gestured in vine, but picked up compressed charcoal, focusing on small details in compressed charcoal or charcoal pencil, as well as big movements in vine. Although this drawing stays really loose, what makes it a successful drawing is how effective the composition is, how the spacing is considered. It's not all even. The hand moves effectively and with a fluid transition, and that the artist showed detail and nuance where it was important and specifically kept certain moments loose, but those moments worked with the overall composition. Most of these drawings are a little bit more developed than this drawing, but it still has a really great overall composition. And in my advice would be to start loose like this with a loose overall composition and then develop your drawing a little further. When you are working out your composition, make sure you sketch out each hand loosely and have a plan before you add a lot of detail and nuance. One of the things I love about this drawing, it's on a blue toned piece of paper, a gray toned piece of paper, but is that the artist not only moves across the page, but in and out of space. If we take a moment to look across this drawing, the hand does move really effectively across the paper, but the hand stays in relative the same position, distance from the viewer. In this great drawing, the artist not only moved their hand and arm across the page, but in deep and then coming close and then moving away. So they moved across the page and in and out of the page. They also were very inventive in how they had the hand and arm move end. I find this can be a really tricky compositional problem. On one hand, it's really, you spend a lot of time thinking about how you're going to pose your hand, but how the arm connects with the background is also a compositional challenge. In this drawing, the artist went really deep and dark in the background, and I love the highlight, shadow, core, reflective light. across their hands. However, although this drawing has a lot of nuance and detail within the actual hands, the overall composition could use some improvements. The way the arms kind of just end in the space is a little awkward, and it's a pretty abrupt jump from jet black to fully rendered hand. It also feels like the poses work with each other, but they maybe don't fit really nicely on the overall page. The spacing is also doesn't really set up a really kind of useful rhythm. In other words, I go from a big space to a medium space to a tiny space to a big space again, and it doesn't really set up a visual rhythm which could help with the movement of the composition. I love the material use in this drawing, but I do think that the overall composition could use some more consideration. This is a beautiful way of addressing, a beautiful and inventive way of addressing the end of the arm problem. I love the way these hands come in. Now, once again, this drawing was done on a piece of paper that the student had already spent 6 hours during class drawing on. And so they then had to take that piece of paper home and add their homework to that paper. So there's a lot of built-up pentimento. This artist used that built-up pentimento really effectively in creating a thick atmosphere in which their drawing really effectively came out of. So there was a really beautiful relationship between the hands and their space. And it was just a really effective use of composition. When you're trying to come up with a composition, be creative. I loved the way this artist kind of pointed out how ridiculous it was to have these kind of severed arms moving across the space by throwing them in a vase. So they solved the problem with humor. There's still a huge amount of fluidity and movement and spacing that happens between the hands. And I love the extra detail of the hand then dropping the flower. There's so much movement. The artist also really used materials effectively. I love the add of the white conte to kind of add the surface of the glass, as well as the smoothness of the vine working in contrast to the sharpness of the compressed charcoal. Overall, I just feel like the material use in this drawing really is just stunning. When you are setting up your composition, it's really helpful to kind of have a narrative. I love where this drawing began with kind of these hands being handing each other flowers, so that there was a sense that one hand was participating differently and the other hand was a stop animation of that one hand, of another set of hands responding to it. And the rendering of the hands is really beautiful. Unfortunately, there's lots of elements in this composition that just don't quite fit. And during the critique, the artist admitted that they just had to kind of add this hand kind of randomly because they forgot that they needed 4. And the composition kind of tells that. There's something beautiful happening between the way the flower comes down and this hand reaches out to grab it, but it doesn't quite line up with the composition. Make sure that you loosely sketch out your composition before adding nuance and detail. I love the way this composition has been put together. You have this beautiful stop animation where you have a hand flicking a coin and then catching the coin. But that action and the arc of the coin has also becomes the arc of the composition. So it's not the arc of the hands moving, but the arc of the coin coming up. There's also a beautiful sense of visual rhythm between the spacing where they flick. There's a visual space here to get a pause. We go from here to here very quickly, just like you would when you were catching. We catch, and then there's a moment where this distance just feels just right. So everything about this composition has been beautifully designed around the action. So they took a simple action and then they built a whole composition out of each of those stages. In addition to the placement of the hands and the rendering of the hands just being stunning, there's also some really great uses of the background. I love the way the mark making in this background gives such a fast, phonetic feel to this drawing. It acts as a great contrast that really shows off the hands, highlighting key moments, illuminating the coin so we don't lose track of it. But it also has this great directional movement where it moves us forward and brings us around. There's also some really inventive uses of the background where sometimes the hand is dark and sometimes the background is light, and sometimes the hand is light and sometimes the background is dark. Just overall, this drawing has taken every single kind of formal element and questioned it and made it more complex. When you're doing an overall composition, you want to kind of consider every space. So the background space is just as crucial. Think back at this drawing, how the mark making and movement in this background really added to the movement of the hands. I think that each of these poses looks really good. There's some real great tension within the hands, but think about how distracting this signature is. Please don't sign your work. I want you to consider every single inch and every single centimeter of your piece of paper as being a vital part of your composition. And so only crucial moments, crucial elements should be in your composition. So no distracting signatures. Consider how that negative space is not empty space. Even if you don't fill it, it's an integral part of your composition. I love how this artist used that background space very subtly to move us through the composition. So even just a simple texture moving down really accentuates how the hands are twisting and turning and shifting and moving around. Rather than being a single gesture animated, similar to the Sarah Siblet drawing, we move through this drawing following the visual pathways in the hand, following the arrows made by one finger, picked up, moved through. And while the first two hands push us off the edge of the page, the mark making in the background helps pull us back down through the composition. And this slight arc, coupled with the intense value range back here, high contrast, dark to light, circles us back around. So it's a beautiful composition that keeps us engaged with visual pathways moving us up and down and up and down. Because the visual pathways are so clear, the drawing has room to make weird tense moments where the fingers get a little tenser and awkwarder here. We can handle this slight awkwardness and feel the tension it creates because the composition moves us through so fluidly. The background can add so much to a piece. When I look at this piece, I love looking at this piece. My eyes move around and through the piece. If I stop and analyze the composition, however, there's lots of suggestions that I have to make. The poses don't really lead one to the other. There isn't kind of a logical sense of how this piece fits together, but the mark making in the background coupled with the mark making in the hands makes the whole piece just feel so right that I don't question the composition because it all feels like I move up and down and up and down. There's also a really good sense of how this artist has used contrast to move me through the composition. I move back in space here, up, have a little pause where it gets a little bit darker, and then pick up and move down back in through here. So not every area in the drawing has been dealt even value, even mark making, even types of contrast. There's different moments of contrast throughout, despite the fact that the whole surface is kind of writhing with these small marks. There is an overall organization of value. That mark making and characteristic of the mark making in the background is so effective that it overrides what is a pretty awkward and unconsidered composition. When you are composing your pieces, plan it out. So I kind of love the meatiness of these hands and the personality of these hands, but the artist ran out of room and just added this fourth hand, and it's pretty obvious. Think about how much time they put into each of these drawings of these hands. And the composition almost completely falls apart because of something they could have planned out in 10, 20, 30 seconds. So loosely sketch out each of your hands before you invest the time. Composition can be really complicated. And this drawing has some beautiful material use and has some inventive compositions. However, the artist has arranged their hands across the pieces of paper as if they were almost just kind of black construction pieces of paper arranged on a piece of paper. They have not considered. Composition can be really tricky. Sometimes overly designing a composition doesn't make it a good composition. In this drawing, the artist clearly thought about where and how to place the hands. Unfortunately, there isn't any logic to this composition. A good composition tells a story. It moves our eyes throughout the picture. It isn't just an arrangement of positive and negative shapes. This artist did some beautiful hand drawings, but there's no logic to how they placed their hands. To them, they said, well, I just created an H because it made a shape. Well, that H did not tell a story, and it didn't move our eyes, and it had nothing to do with this beautiful velvety charcoal mark making. We just kind of looked at it. Make sure when you are creating a composition, the first question should be, what is the goal of this composition? What is the mood of this piece? What is the theme? What is the story I am trying to tell? Try to avoid making composition just about arranging shapes on a piece of paper, because these shapes may have been an interesting composition if they were black rectangles on a white field, but they're not that interesting when they are hands. The artist also, though hard to see in this slide, made this H-like composition and put it in the center of their white piece of paper without any relationship to the border. This drawing, on the other hand, was done by an artist who didn't have a lot of rendering skills, but was really inventive with their composition. And while I think that the way that they have drawn their hands maybe isn't as accurate or as rendered as some of the other drawings in the class. When this drawing was on the wall in the classroom, we couldn't take our eyes off of it because the composition was just so good. The artist was inventive, they told a story, they created interesting positive and negative shapes that moved us through the composition. They treated that background as equally important as the hands, and everything about this design, the way the hands twisted, the use of the volume in the hands, the undulating arm, that a line that the hands were drawing, all just made it a really dynamic composition that felt really strong and felt like everything on the piece of paper had been considered. And so it made an incredibly successful drawing. Composition, the design of the positive and negative spaces, and how it tells a story has a really loud visual voice. If you have to choose between a good composition and something rendered well, the good composition, to my eye, will always be more effective than something that is simply rendered well. The last image I want to look at is this one. I think that there are things in this composition that we could question, but the artist had a huge amount of fun making this image, and they had a story they wanted to tell. They wove their hands with their partner's hands, and they loved making the contrast between the way their hands looked to their partner's hands. And that was clear when we looked at it. It was clear with the detail and nuance and attention that they put into it. And it therefore came across in the drawing. So make sure you're fully committed and fully behind your ideas. If you are excited about the drawing that you're going to make, you will put the time in to make it a successful drawing. All right, I'm looking forward to seeing your projects. Thank you very much.